At T-Mobile, our critical mission is providing unparalleled 5G coverage for when connectivity is mission critical. Introducing T-Priority, America's best 5G network experience for first responders, even in times of congestion. More capacity, faster speeds, better coverage. T-Priority from T-Mobile, built for tomorrow's emergencies, ready today. Discover more at t-priority.com.
For qualifying organizations on eligible rate plans, coverage not available in some areas and may be impacted by emergencies.
This episode is brought to you by Prime Video. In the small town of Holland, Michigan, nothing is ever what it seems. Behind the tulip festivals and pretty houses lay dark secrets that threaten to tear a marriage apart. Nicole Kidman stars in this darkly twisted thriller about a wife and mother whose quest to uncover her husband's secrets may get her more than she bargained for. Holland, streaming on Prime Video, March 27th.
And now, two pigeons who can't believe how good humans have it with DirecTV.
These humans are hopping from streaming apps to live sports without batting a wing.
All from the DirecTV home screen.
With just one click, you could be watching a baseball game, a movie on Netflix,
or a critically acclaimed documentary.
You watch documentaries?
I love the ones that leave you with a question.
What?
Exactly.
DirecTV, a better way to watch whatever you want to watch. Visit DirecTV.com.
Internet-connected Gemini device, separate Netflix membership, and additional paid subscriptions required for third-party apps.
Loneliness and isolation were a clear pattern in a lot of these individuals that I encountered in extremist groups. And it's also perhaps even when faced with a very challenging phase in their lives, a vulnerability, an identity crisis, they often felt like they were completely alone with it. And there was no community to share this with, to also sometimes share the suffering with. And that's where some of these online communities become so appealing, because they offer a community and they offer a place where you can share grievances that create an extremely powerful group bonding effect called identity fusion, when your personal identity becomes one with the group identity. So there's clearly a strong sense of a need for belonging that, unfortunately, some of these extremist movements can tap into.
Hello, mega orderers. We are back with Julia Ebner, everyone's favorite princess of counter-radicalization and queen of extremist infiltration. It was a great joy speaking to her at length about her book, Why Extreme Ideas Are Spreading and What We Can Do About It. Today, we're going to delve deeper into how extremist ideas infiltrate the mainstream, how they fundamentally shift our narrative about what is normal and what is not normal, and how ideas like QAnon, the vaccine, having a microchip, and things like this are not just funny, silly ideas, but have changed the very nature of our politics and the programs that people like RFK Jr. and Trump and Musk and Bannon can implement in today's world. And what I'd like to talk about, Julia, is why is it that hate groups and extremist groups don't advocate for incremental change? Why don't they advocate for the rolling back of a tiny little piece of legal legislation? They seem to like to go whole hog and advocate for mass deportation, genocide, let's change the sexual mores. And yet, on the other hand, because if extremists are not gradualists, why is it that soccer moms in the center, why can't they advocate for bold and abrupt societal changes to deal with our threats? And they tend to, because I'm always called a centrist Starmer dad. That's what my trolls online attack me as. Why is it that my group has difficulty advocating for the kind of bold changes?
I mean, to start with, I do think that they have a clear strategy about testing where exactly they have to push the right buttons and how far they can go. So it's all about shifting the Overton window, shifting the window of what's acceptable in public discourse. And in some of these extremist movements that I spent some time in, they even called this controlled provocation, where, for example, some of their public-facing campaigns, they were pushing the boundaries of what's acceptable just a little bit further each time. So it was, in that sense, it was incremental. But when compared, of course, to the centrist discourse or the centrist rhetoric, and also when it comes to policy changes, they are quite radical. But they're perceived as just a bit radical and not too radical either, because those that are really radical, those would be, say, the accelerationist movements who think that we should go straight to a race war, that this is inevitable to use violent means to push back. Those are not usually getting the same large-scale results, and they would never be able to mainstream their ideas on the same political stage. So I think a lot of these movements, extremist movements that have managed to basically leak their ideas into the mainstream, have had a very clear management of their reputation and also of where they stand in those policies. For example, when I met up with Generation Identity members and also their leader, Martin Sellner, they're these white nationalists who try to push back against the Great Replacement. They were talking about how radical should their campaigns be. They should hit a nerve. So they were clearly thinking about what is it that people get most upset about. For example, when they thought about expanding their operations to the UK and Ireland, they thought very clearly that, for example, Muslim grooming gangs or the jihadist terrorist attacks are a good entry gate. And they wanted to do something very provocative so that they would generate a lot of media attention, that they could go viral, and where it would convey the impression that they would push for radical change, but not too radical either. So it's often, I think, about hitting that right balance.
Interesting. So even radical groups understand that they need to hit a balance. I buy that. Now let's talk about how airing extreme ideas online in niche web forums can actually change overall political agendas by major political parties. My dear mega orderers, just to show you the kind of people I like to hang with here on the Disorder program, I want to let you know I have an ex-girlfriend who could be frequently caught proselytizing at dinner parties about the relevance of the Overton window. And this is the concept that Julia just mentioned. My ex would say things about how we can't understand how Brexit changed the debate in the UK without understanding how the Overton window of political discourse has been changed by Brexit. And what worried her most about Brexit or Netanyahu or making accommodations with certain racist worldviews is that once the Overton window is pushed out, then ever increasingly radical ideas can become more and more mainstream. Having heard her explain that idea, I was always skeptical, because I'm not sure that political programs and political ideological transposition works this way. However, if she believes it and you believe it, I'm willing to be converted. So could you please explain to the listeners, 1, what is the concept of the Overton window? 2, how do small numbers of misogynists, anti-vaxxers, skinheads, jihadis, Israeli settlers, white Christian nationalists use this phenomenon to move the debate and the terrain of political discourse in a direction that more suits them?
Yeah, the Overton window, it's an interesting concept because it's all about what is acceptable in public discourse at a specific time and in a specific geography. So, of course, that is very fluid. It changes all the time on different topics. But what we've seen is that usually quite dramatic changes that cause collective trauma, for example, or collective grievances can drastically change the Overton window. For example, terrorist attacks or, for example, global pandemics. Those things create, I guess, a cognitive opening where people are more susceptible to change. And that's exactly where the extremist groups know how to play that and how to exploit these windows of opportunity in a way where they can then shift the Overton window further. And we've seen that on many occasions. And I guess it's a bit like opening Pandora's box. Once with the Brexit campaign, for example, the Brexit campaign, if you remember, of Nigel Farage and of UKIP showing this breaking point poster of masses of migrants lined up in a queue that looked very similar to the Holocaust, to the Nazi propaganda. It had striking visual parallels. And that it created this impression of we're being overrun, we're being invaded or taken over by non-European or non-white migrants, and we have to push back against this. And it created this new space for what was then more acceptable to talk about foreigners and talk about migrants in a much more explicit way. And the same can be said now of Trump, for example, or of the normalization of some discourse around migration or around feminism and women's rights or LGBTQ rights. And on a lot of these issues, the Overton window has definitely shifted in the last few years. It becomes almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Once more people start believing in it, the window can shift further and further and further, and it's quite a slippery slope.
Now, I think, my dear mega orderers, that this concept about the Overton window is not just academic or theoretical. It has real life implications for how we think about global order. I'm going to try to contextualize this debate further. There are some ways in which you have won me over here, because when at a Trump event, a comedian just a few weeks before the 2024 election said that Puerto Rico is like a floating island of garbage, I thought we had won the election. I didn't back out of my popular vote bet on Harris, because although I thought Harris was a fundamentally flawed candidate, he just went and insulted not only the 4 million Americans of Puerto Rican ancestry, but mutatis mutandi, the 40 million Latino Americans. We're going to win the popular vote. This is absolutely insane. And inasmuch as it appears that those comments barely moved the voter dial at all, even in highly Puerto Rican areas like Scranton, Pennsylvania, where Harris did significantly worse among Latinos than Joe Biden had done previously, I will have to concede that it seems like the Overton window had moved, right? Because it wouldn't have been acceptable in the days of Bill Clinton to have been like, I think Puerto Rico is an island of garbage. You would have hurt yourself with the Puerto Rican vote, and now you haven't. But I also want to push back on the other side of this. Personally, my inclination as a political figure and as a pundit is to make accommodations with the most moderate wing of any supposed extremist ideology. So there's an anti-immigrant grouping. Some people will just say, we can't assimilate them all at once. They may not hate them, but they're just like, there aren't enough school places. I want to see people in the center left accommodate with them. Or the anti-abortion ones, I don't want to allow Trump to say the Democrats allow abortion even after birth and they're killing the babies and whatever. So let's get some people from the anti-abortion movement and say, we propose no third trimester abortions unless the health of the mother is involved. And then we could win them over and they could support us. So that's my inclination, is that if we had savvier leaders who could make those alliances, we would have done better and prevented the rise of the more extreme versions of these ideologies. Am I missing something? Does that not work? Is that misunderstanding how the Overton window works?
I think that's right. And perhaps actually dialogue would have been the key to avoid such a strong shift of the Overton window. Because I think what happened through canceling people who had views that were perhaps outside of what was seen as acceptable or what was perhaps the dominant view, it also meant that there was less dialogue and these people could, in the background, help build up their own alternative news networks, their own conspiracy myth networks. And a lot of these ideas started spreading beyond the traditional news, obviously, and beyond the traditional social media platforms, kind of in the shadow of what was happening otherwise. And I think there was almost a point in time where it was a turning point and we overlooked that. And that's also why what we call the culture wars, I guess, have now taken a completely different turn, because there was this turning point and a lot of this was happening behind the scenes. I mean, a lot of this was because people were fed up with reporting on the traditional news that they then switched to alternative podcasts, especially were actually quite successful, I think, in generating completely new audiences for relatively radical views that were hitting a nerve in people who were fed up with the situation. And I think that led to this massive backlash against things like Me Too, against Black Lives Matter, against LGBTQ and trans rights, against abortion rights. So I think there was definitely something that was overlooked, especially on the Democrat side, but also in other political contexts, not just in the US.
What was overlooked? The ability to make an accommodation?
I think the importance of dialogue and of really listening to people who might have a slightly different view on things and trying to accommodate them in some way. And that doesn't always mean compromising. And perhaps in some of the cases, it would have just been a matter of even just listening to their worries and their concerns. And especially when it comes to, for example, things like science. And obviously, it is understandable that you don't want to give airtime to someone who spreads basically lies and presents wrong information about something that is actually scientifically proven, like the COVID pandemic, for example. But there could have been more moments where I think we could have catered to audience who were suspicious or skeptical, who felt that there was an information vacuum, and addressed their concerns. And when thinking back about the vaccines, of course, in the early stages of the development and even when they were released, there was a lot of worry, for example, and some of the worries were actually legitimate, for example, in minority communities, that it hadn't perhaps not been tested enough on people with minority backgrounds or pregnant women, for example. There was a wave of concern. And that could be hijacked by people who wanted to exploit this skepticism and this concern.
To me, the key point of what you've just said there, Julia, is the need to make people feel that you hear them. Bill Clinton and Tony Blair were geniuses at making people feel like they were heard. Something about Harris and Biden, I can't understand what it is. They don't make people feel like they hear them. Biden, maybe because he became generationally out of pace with America, right? So there was something going on there. But this is so critical in very popular leaning democracies, because I might argue we had more elite inclined democracies prior to World War II. People were willing to vote for their class betters. Now there's a desire to not look up to your quote unquote class better. And in this situation, this phenomenon of needing to make people feel like they are heard is so critical. So that's what I want to take away from that answer. Now I want to talk about appeasement and why this might not work with real radicals. So I have spoken to a few jihadis in my day. I have. And I've spoken to Israeli Jewish supremacist settlers. I don't know so much about the skinhead and anti-vax or misogynist movements. It's not something that I encounter, right? Am I correct in saying that you really can't appease the extremes of those movements if you try to be like, let's have a negotiation about how what we want here and what you want can be accommodated, because in fact, there is no accommodation that's possible?
I think it depends a lot on where they stand. And I guess it's to some extent, it's actually similar for jihadists and for any other political extremist. I think that it depends a lot on where in the radicalization process you are. But I guess in general, I've almost never been successful with factual arguments. It's always about understanding what are the emotions and the psychological purposes behind their endorsement of extremist ideologies, or especially conspiracy myths. There's always a hidden psychological purpose that a conspiracy myth fulfills. I think it's very often about understanding those. And that's partly also what I meant by we need politicians and boundary crossing politicians, exactly what you said, who make exactly these people, even the people on the fringes of society, feel heard in their concerns, in their actual emotional reasons for why they would even go to completely alternative extremist ideas and solutions, and try and find some kind of bridge on the psychological level to bring them back.
Let's continue to talk more about the Overton window. How would you say that fringe conspiracy theorists who believe, for example, that Bill Gates puts a chip in the vaccine to monitor us, or that a secret cabal of pedophiles runs the U.S. government, how have they actually changed the policies that the Trump administration and the DOJ is now doing? How have they changed the terrain on which the issues of our day and elections are being fought?
I mean, first of all, Robert F. Kennedy, as the new person in charge for health policies, is, of course, catering to exactly those audience and has already...
Are you saying, Julia, he doesn't just want to make America healthy again?
That is a very strong slogan. But yeah, it's interesting because he's not even just using dog whistles. He's, of course, been one of the most prominent figures in the conspiracy myth movement around QAnon and at the anti-vax movement. So it's also, he's not a person that would even be subtle in a way. You know where he stands on all of these topics. And that's what I find quite scary. And it actually really shows how strongly the Overton window has shifted. Because if we can choose someone who has such a strong track record of spreading misinformation, disinformation on scientific topics and even conspiracy myths, without facing any kind of societal backlash or legal consequences. It's actually pretty shocking. But I think in the coming years, we've of course not yet seen that much change, but I think in the coming years under this Trump administration, we'll see massive changes on all levels when it comes to health policies. Of course, leaving the WHO would be quite a massive step, but also completely reversing some of the vaccine policies in the US. And I think that will definitely lead to some potentially dangerous dynamics.
Having covered conspiracy theories and the mainstreamization that they can cause in certain discourses via this Overton window concept, I'd like to get into some more details of the various groups and ideologies that you've studied. In your book, Going Mainstream, I found the chapter on the incels the most eye-opening and the most fascinating. So let's focus on the concept of blue-pilled, red-pilled, and black-pilled. I had heard of these ideas through listening to the Coming Storm BBC podcast with our shared friend Ben Ansel. And he talks about red-pilling, but I didn't understand how could these ideas have anything to do with your views on women or relationships with women in society. Could you tell us about what it means to be red-pilled and how these discourses evolve?
The word red pill originally comes from The Matrix, the movie The Matrix, and is about taking the red pill, seeing the world as it really is, as opposed to taking the blue pill where you live in this illusion. And it's interesting because red pill has been used across different extremist online subcultures. It's something that the alt-right has used for their ideas about what's actually going on, supposedly with white populations being erased by non-whites. And the ultimate black pill for the alt-right is that it's actually the Jews who are behind this.
So you didn't introduce the black pill. Why is there a black pill? That's not in the Matrix.
Yeah. Oh, so black pill is not in Matrix, but that's a new invention by the incel forums. And what I find interesting is indeed that crossover of vocabulary and of insider references across these different subcultures, which are loosely connected but don't have that much to do with each other either. So, for example, the white nationalists use exactly the same words as the incels. The incel movement, they have the red pill, which in their world is more about male supremacy. But then they also have the black pill, where they give up any hope in humanity, basically, and they give up any hope in being able to compensate what they think is genetically inferior about themselves. They're, of course, very insecure individuals who are on these incel platforms, and some of them actually go on to commit suicide, and others go on to commit really terrible crimes. But most of them are just very harmful in spreading these ideas about supposedly the black pill.
Could you tell us about the red pill wives and their subreddit?
So the red pill community in the misogynist sphere, they believe that even if you're, as they put it, genetically inferior, you're not an alpha male, you can compensate for that by being very charismatic, by playing women in the right way. So there's a whole community, the pickup artists who think they can manipulate women into sleeping with them. So that's the red pill for the misogynistic sphere. And then you also have the red pill women community, which to me was extremely fascinating, but also shocking to go into, because you have a whole range of female influencers and women who think that, well, that actually the world should be very different from what it is now. We should go back to the 1950s, and where women are supposedly in the roles that they should fulfill. They belong in the kitchen and in the household, looking after kids, and should still be asking their partners for permission when they want to work, and should listen to their husbands, obey to him, and that this is the happiest life for both men and women. That is, for them, that is the red pill. And sometimes this is then also combined with ideas about, well, I guess, not just the traditional family, but also white, a very homogenous white society with white children, and the woman playing a big part in that because they are about reproduction. So there's this gap that they also fill when connecting misogynistic ideas with white supremacist ideas, because the woman has a key role in reproducing white children, essentially. And there are some female influencers who've made a huge following because they, for example, help men, and they even frame it that way, to red pill their girlfriends or red pill their wives, to basically manipulate them in a direction that would be leaning towards alt-right ideas and where they could gradually basically brainwash their partners, their female partners.
So there is an ideological struggle online within different male and female communities about how to contextualize male-female relations. Would you say that this is new, or is it this very old, and that even going back to the ancient Greeks, there were discussions about the relationship between men and women and their spheres, and that there was no static moment, not in the 1890s, but not even in the 1950s, because they led to the 1960s, that there has always been debates and discourse on these questions?
I think that's right. There's always been debate about the best spheres of responsibility and share of labor between men and women, and also about, even just on a more existential level, what masculinity is or what womanhood should be, and how we should perceive our roles in society, but also how we should perceive ourselves. And I think that is something that has, however, been driven to the extreme. And I think it's a combination of different factors. But one of the key factors that is, of course, very strongly at the moment driving young men towards these misogynistic forms, and that's been addressed in various books, is the kind of sense that a lot of young men and boys are struggling more with their roles today, that there seems to be a development where boys are struggling more in school than girls, their performance has dropped, there are higher suicide rates among men, which are highlighted in a lot of these forums. But there is a problem with the dating culture, the online dating culture, where we see from statistics that the top 20% of men who are perceived as the best looking, or the with the highest, quote from those forms, sexual market value, get 80% of the women, and the other 80% just basically leave these dating platforms without having any success. And all of these different, I guess, layers of what they think modern society is to blame for have left a lot of men feeling that they have been losing their privileges, also because of course, feminist policies and women's rights. And that has caused this huge uptick in radicalization towards misogynistic extremist groups. And also young boys, almost every school-age boy now knows who Andrew Tate is. And some of them even quote his ideas about pushing for domestic violence and violence against women, and even some of his pro-rape kind of ideas. So I think that is hugely concerning. But I think we often forget to talk about the flip side, or the other side, basically a femininity crisis, which has also announced itself, I think, in the last few years, where we see an increasing amount of women going towards those traditional tradwife communities, or the red pill women forums, where there's also a question that has opened up for a lot of women. What does femininity mean? What does womanhood mean? What is my role? Why don't I find the partner that I want to find? There are other questions related to the hookup culture, where women feel increasingly exploited on dating platforms, or related to the double burdens about the modern role of the woman in society, of having to juggle work and children. And I think all of these questions have also led to a bit of an identity crisis among women, but we forget to talk about that. And I think that's partly the reason why some of these communities of the tradwives and the red pill women have been so successful.
Well, I think what you've hit at is a crisis not only in dating and in masculinity and femininity, but in culture in general, which is that from my generation to the generation slightly younger, so much has changed in terms of the books people read and how they treat each other and how confident they are talking to strangers and whatever. And culture is just lost. And with this degree and rapidity of social change, people don't know where to turn. So they're going to turn to different extremes. Let's try to connect this back to the issue of the Overton window, Julia. My assumption is that the growth of these extremist movements, as it increases, their ideas can get mainstream, and then their less extreme concerns seem normal, right? But what I think that I haven't seen enough research on, and I'm not faulting you for not dealing with this in your book because, you know, it's only a traditional length book. You can't deal with every topic. Aren't these groups onto something? The pace of change in society is so rapid, social views and norms about the relationships of men and women, or of online life and in-person life, or of religion and sexual moral, like that these things have actually changed very rapidly. They are, quote unquote, correct. Our grandparents would not have handled these situations the way that we're asked to handle them. So I'm wondering, what do you think we in the center can do to provide a different discourse that handles these very disruptive changes in a constructive way?
I agree that the grievances are legitimate, and some of the changes have happened so fast that I think there is a mismatch between what we're expected to do and what's realistic to do. But also in some of the cases, a mismatch between legislation and laws that have been introduced that are in favor of women's rights or LGBTQ rights, and at the same time, societal expectations that haven't really changed, and prejudice that is still there. So I think we've fought the battle on a legal level, and there has been a lot of progress in the direction of improving human rights, but we haven't really kept pace on a societal level with the changes. And I think that's exactly the problem, because a lot of men from what I hear, and even even in my circles, feel that they are on the losing end with a lot of these trends. And they feel also that perhaps even the distribution of roles, which should be more equal on all levels, there's not enough societal recognition yet that men should perhaps also play an equally large role in the household or with childcare. And at the same time, women are facing this massive double burden expectation. And I think societally, we just haven't really moved as far as we should have, perhaps. And it's also, even on an emotional and self-reflection level, I think we're still, unfortunately, very far behind.
That's an interesting answer. I'm going to try to take it from another perspective. In your book, Going Mainstream, you don't really discuss the loss of community or the ethnic change that people have experienced in the places that they grew up, and how that and the destruction of the traditional family, which is real. I mean, the percentage of divorce from the time of our grandparents to now, I mean, it's huge, the number of changes. And you talk about behavior patterns on the extreme end, whether it's playing Call of Duty or giving Hitler salutes or asserting that all gender bathrooms will make way for transhumanism and machines replacing humans or the New World Order. I think we need to talk more in, for lack of a better term, the liberal elite, the center left, the policy space, about the quote-unquote real grievances of white nationalists, anti-trans activists. And I think that a lot of their grievances are not super real, but some of them are real, and maybe we need to be studying them more seriously and give a greater account of how those changes have happened.
I do agree with that, and I think we do need to talk more about the grievances. And the grievances should be seen as legitimate grievances, but the policy choices and the direction of travel that these extremist movements are promoting isn't legitimate.
With all this conspiratorial extremism out there, what can be done? We'll tell you when we come back after the break, and Julia and I order the disorder.
Switch to Verizon Business and get more from your internet without paying more for your internet. Get LTE Business Internet starting at $39 a month when paired with a Business Unlimited smartphone plan. That's unlimited data, and with it, unlimited possibilities. Start saving today with Verizon Business, ranked #1 in small business internet customer satisfaction by J.D. Power. Starting price for 25 megabits per second internet plan with savings, plus taxes, fees, and economic adjustment charge. Terms apply. For J.D. Power 2024 award information, visit jdpower.com/awards.
I can say to my new Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, hey, find a keto-friendly restaurant nearby and text it to Beth and Steve. And it does, without me lifting a finger. So I can get in more squats anywhere I can. 1, 2, 3.
Will that be cash or credit?
Credit. 4.
Galaxy S25 Ultra, the AI companion that does the heavy lifting so you can do you. Get yours at Samsung.com. Compatible with select apps. Requires Google Gemini account. Results may vary based on input. Check responses for accuracy.
What if an appliance emergency didn't have to be? If your appliances suddenly decided they were done, don't stress. Best Buy has you covered with a wide variety of major appliances from trusted brands, in stock and available now. So you don't have to worry about laundry piling up, refilling the fridge, or that big dinner party you're hosting. Because Best Buy has the knowledge and expertise to get you the right appliance for your home. Learn more at bestbuy.com. Best Buy. Imagine that.
Okay, Julia, we've covered so much ground, from discussing incel forums to the Overton window. The time has come. Please help me order the disorder. Let's grapple with the need that humans feel for community and solidarity amidst all these changes. So allow me to say, where we go one, we go all. Alt-right conspiracy theories play on this need for community and this need for belonging. Let's talk about how the decline of traditional religiosity and the traditional family leaves people feeling rootless. How do you, having infiltrated all of these forums and read their books and their discourses, see this social change and this need for community that we're facing?
Loneliness and isolation were a clear pattern in a lot of these individuals that I encountered in extremist groups. And it's also perhaps even when faced with a very challenging phase in their lives, a vulnerability, an identity crisis, they often felt like they were completely alone with it. And there was no community to share this with, to also sometimes share the suffering with. And that's where some of these online communities become so appealing, because they offer a community and they offer a place where you can share grievances that others also experience, perhaps on the other side of the world, but they do offer a place. And I know you had Harvey Whitehouse on one of your podcast episodes, but what our research in Oxford also shows is that it's often the shared suffering, the shared grievances that you share with an in-group that create an extremely powerful group bonding effect called identity fusion, when your personal identity becomes one with the group identity. And this is exactly what's happening in a lot of these extremist forums and groups, where they start to perceive these online, even online people as family-like, as kin-like, and they become replacements of their biological families and of their absent community. So there's clearly a strong sense of a need for belonging that, unfortunately, some of these extremist movements can tap into.
That's very compelling to me. And I think traditional religion and traditional community activities, whether it's playing European football with your neighbors or going to the bake sale or whatever, that stuff is really critical. And we haven't done a great job in the center left to figure out how to cultivate that. You write that the conventional left-right cleavage might not be the important one anymore, but truth-based versus anti-truth-based, or crazy versus not so crazy, might be the domain of our politics. So this seems to be what we're going to be facing with the Trump administration. It's not really about a different view about the role of tax policy. Like, that is not the grievance that I have when I look at the Trump administration. So how do we, in the punditry sphere and in the opinion formation game, deal with this changed political debate?
It's a really tricky question, and I'm glad I don't have this responsibility that you have. But I do think that humor is a great tool that can be used, and perhaps even to convince people of how crazy actually some of the things are that we are seeing. Because I'm not sure that everyone who voted for Trump was fully aware of the level of craziness that we would see and were yet to see. And also what we saw with, I guess what perhaps is another really useful tool is to look at unshared experiences and to look at why, on some levels, Trump is not at all what a lot of the people who voted for him thought he was. And I think he is now really showing his true face on many levels. And especially also this alliance with Elon Musk, that is very much at odds of his alliance with Vance, who is standing up for working class people, or who has at least this track record of being perceived as this person who can reach the working class, who can reach people who feel left behind economically. And now this is completely at odds. And there are so many paradoxes that I think can be dealt with either with using humor or even just exposing some of these contradictions of the Trump administration.
I love it. I mean, I thought that we could have run Bill Maher as the presidential candidate, and we should be using the Jon Stewarts of the world to greater effect because humor exposes the absurd contradictions and downright hypocrisy within the crazy sphere. So you know what they say about great minds. It's no surprise that Going Mainstream concludes with a chapter entitled, What Can We Do? And we conclude every podcast, even a two-parter like this, with this Ordering the Disorder segment. And you highlight in this chapter various touch points, that's your term, of how we can push back on the extremists. Can you share very briefly some regulatory or tech ideas that might be silver bullets?
Yeah, I think for the tech space, we're now at an extremely difficult point in time. And the book was published before that point in time where we saw this massive shift now in recent months of the tech giants basically reversing everything they'd done in terms of takedowns of explicitly hateful accounts and content and even systematic disinformation, which now stays online again. And where we've seen whether it's Mark Zuckerberg, of course, Elon Musk has led that wave, or whether it's YouTube, we now see that there's a pushback against these policies. And it now feels a little bit as though we're back in kind of 7 years ago when we first started introducing these anti-hate speech policies. And at the same time, there is now on a political level, at least in Europe and in the UK, more regulation that has been introduced with the Digital Services Act in the EU and the Online Safety Bill in the UK. And it's very much a conflict that is, I think, just where we're just at the beginning, a conflict between policies, anti-hate speech policies, and the reality of how the tech giants are handling it. And I do think we're going to see an escalation of that conflict at some point. But what I would say is extremely important is that we stay very much on balance with the principle of course, safeguarding freedom of speech should be extremely important, but we should only go as far as to not let complete freedom of speech infringe on other people's freedom of speech. So I guess it's about those boundaries of at what point can hate speech intimidate people so far that it actually leads to less freedom of speech because people feel silenced because they're being targeted by hate campaigns. And I think that's one of the paradoxes of some of these no limits freedom of speech policies, that actually it can reduce freedom of speech when people feel that they're being disproportionately targeted.
You posed the question, how can you prevent turning legitimate fears and frustration into irrational, hateful actions? I know that this may be something that we have touched on in other answers, but could you try to hit us with one specific thing that the listeners can try to do and take home?
One of the key things I'd say everyone can do is be more aware of our own psychology in online spaces, be more aware of toxic group dynamics and of how online spaces change our identities and how, these really powerful group dynamics can have a huge impact on how we behave and also on how our attitudes form. I think that's something where if we can give that to our children, to our friends, to our surrounding, if we can share some of these learnings, that would be hugely helpful, because I think we're still in the early stages of getting to know ourselves in that new sphere of social media and the internet, where it's almost comparable to, I guess, the invention of cars, which led to, decades of not really knowing how to deal with traffic systems, what kind of safety measures to put in place. And I would even say 100 years until we fully understood what are the implications of drinking and driving, and actually some of the even medicines or drugs that might have an impact on our behavior in a car or in the traffic system. So I think we're still now, with social media and the internet being a much more novel invention, we're still in the early stages of getting to know our own behavior and the risks associated with that on a societal level.
3 final rapid-fire questions. What about defending experts and expertise and elites and elitists online? I have always said, when it was unfashionable, I'm an elitist. I may not be an elite in everything I do, but I want the best ACL surgeon to do the surgery on my ACL. I want the best podcast technician to edit my podcast. Fortunately, I have him. He's named George McDonagh. I want the best experts as guests on my podcast to talk about the radicalization of ideas and the mainstreaming of hate speech. Fortunately, I have her online today. Why do people not defend the elites? I want to have Tom Brady quarterbacking my team, and I'll say it online. What can we do to defend the idea? Everyone is an elitist in a way. They want elites. They want expertise. Help us.
Yeah, I think that is true. But there's a book by Peter Turchin called The End Times, where he, of course, puts forward this idea that it's actually an overproduction of elites that often is leading up to disorder and to instability and to drastic regime changes. I think there's something to that, where the people who don't feel like they've become part of the elite, whichever elite it is, elites that have access to the best healthcare, elites that have best access to education and so on, or to the best jobs, they feel increasingly like they're losing out. And I think the age of social media is making that problem even more relevant, because we see on a constant level, we're exposed to the best possible resorts and holiday destinations and best social media pictures. So we constantly feel like perhaps I'm losing out. And I think there is something there where, unfortunately, that doesn't really get out the best in us as human beings.
I think there's a lot of brilliance to this answer. There is a mismatch between the production of societal skills and the opportunities and the skills they require. And then there's a mismatch between what people think they want and what's actually on offer and what they see. And that social media and the changes in our economy have promoted that. Penultimate question. Can we in the educated expert class not do a better job standing up for why letting experts make policies is actually better for everyone? I want that there is a body called USAID or the Health Bureau or the whatever, where the smartest PhDs allocate the resources in a technical way, and I don't want those people to be elected. I absolutely do not want that either Democratic or Republican politicians put in the people that they just want to run those bureaus. I don't want that. I want a Mandarin system with a hierarchical ladder whereby the permanent undersecretary of the thing is someone that no one has ever heard of, and they have the expertise and they make the decisions. Why is it that we are doing such a bad job convincing people that that's the way everything worked? That's how the British Empire worked. That's how America worked from 1945 to the end of the Cold War, when whether you were voting for Ronald Reagan or Jimmy Carter, and you couldn't have two more different politicians, that's how the decision worked. What are we doing wrong that people don't get that?
You just exposed another major paradox in the Trump administration, I realized, because they talk a lot about merit-based kind of systems, and then it's all based on who you're friends with and who is most loyal to you, and that's how he selects the people he puts into his cabinet. But I agree that I think that we should actually perhaps even have tests that test for different skill sets, different expertise, especially for some of the specific minister positions where you actually need technical knowledge to deal with, say, a pandemic or health crisis or with the economy. I think it shouldn't be just the case that anyone could do those jobs, because there's a lot at stake if you get it wrong. And I think in addition to that, we should also have psychological fitness or mental health fitness tests.
This would disqualify everyone in the Trumpian milieu because they're all filled with the dark triad traits. They could never accept it.
Getting back to where we started the first podcast episode, exactly, the dark triad and the overrepresentation in politics, I think, is really a scary and disturbing phenomenon.
Great. It's been amazing going on this journey with you over the 2 episodes, Julia. I hope that the mega ordering listeners have enjoyed it as much as I have. Last final question. If you were queen for a day and could create one global institution to prevent extremist ideas from going mainstream, what would this institution be? How would it function?
This institution would sit at the intersection of digital literacy and psychology. I think what it would do would, and I've actually seen that idea online now, I forgot where exactly, but would basically inoculate people with microdoses of what it feels like to be manipulated online or to start getting involved into conspiracy theories, to make them understand in a very vivid way what it feels like to get into a conspiracy myth movement or into an extremist movement. So it's basically the same concept as vaccines, of giving you a microdose of something to ultimately, hopefully, make you immune against that. So that is actually a great idea that someone has already taken out there and I think is currently doing something with it. I would have to look it up again, who that is.
From your mouth to God's and Keir Starmer's ears, we shall pre-bunk the unwashed masses and prevent them from falling into conspiracy theory rabbit holes. I hope you have enjoyed ordering the disorder with me, Julia.
It was great. Thank you so much for having me.
And there you have it, mega orderers. If Julia were queen for a day, she would create an institution to inoculate people from misinformation and to pre-bunk the ways in which we get radicalized. I love it. I hope you enjoyed listening to Julia and I discuss conspiracy theories, extremism, how crazy ideas become mainstream, what we can do about it, as much as we enjoyed recording it. Please follow the links in the show notes to find out more about Julia as a speaker, the concept of the Overton window explained, and my article, A Lizard Person's Guide to the U.S. Election Conspiracy Theories, that I did with the New European many, many moons ago, before we descended into the dark days of Trump 2.0. As always, our producer has been George McDonagh. Our executive producer is Neil Fearn. I am wishing you an orderly and very mainstream week.
The political landscape has changed.
The country is changing direction. It's a big moment and a very, very difficult one.
The New Statesman podcast is here to help you understand what's really going on in Westminster and beyond.
I think there's a sense in Downing Street that this is the vision, this is the narrative, this is the plan.
I'm Hannah Barnes. Join me, Andrew Marr, the New Statesman's politics team and political guests every Thursday and Friday. Search The New Statesman in your podcast app now.